Hello and welcome to the Friday, November 21st, 2025 edition of the SANS Internet Storm Center's Stormcast. My name is Johannes Ulrich, recording today from Jacksonville, Florida. And this episode is brought to you by the SANS.edu Bachelor's Degree Program in Applied Cybersecurity. Well, in diaries today, let's start with Oracle Identity Manager. In October, as part of its critical patch update that Oracle releases once a quarter, one critical vulnerability was patched in Oracle Identity Manager that not only allows authentication bypass, but also remote code execution as part of that authentication bypass. And with Oracle Identity Manager being sort of a critical part of the entire Oracle ecosystem, this is certainly a big deal. And Oracle Identity Manager was also sort of one of the issues behind the breach of Oracle's cloud earlier this year. Now, today, Searchlight Cyber did release some details regarding this vulnerability, and it turns out exploitation is pretty straightforward, pretty simple for this vulnerability. It's essentially a bug in the Oracle Identity Manager authentication logic that any URL that adds with .wadl will bypass authentication. Now, typically, if you just add .wadl, you end up with a different file that it points to, and you get a 404 error, so not much happens there. But if you do a semicolon .wadl, the authentication bypass still works, and you're not pointing to a different URL. So this is basically what Searchlight Cyber found and then reported to Oracle. Now, seeing that particular proof of concept URL that Searchlight Cyber published, I went back through our honeypot logs to see if you already see any exploitation for this vulnerability. Well, I didn't see anything for today or the last couple days, but I did see some exploitation for the first week of September, so well before the vulnerability was actually patched and publicly known. The URL that's being exploited there against our honeypots is slightly different, but still use that same semicolon .wadl pattern. So maybe a different group found the same vulnerability. And given that they hit our honeypots, it's fair to assume that they did internet-wide scans and as a result probably hit a lot of these Oracle Identity Managers that were exposed at the time and may have exploited some of them. So this kind of changes the equation here a little bit. If you're running Oracle Identity Manager, if you patched as the patch was released in October, you still may have to go back and check for compromise prior to patching if this particular exploit hit your particular system before you applied the patch. And Apple security company YAMF has published a blog post with details regarding a new infostealer that they spotted. This particular infostealer tricks users into installing it by claiming to be Dynamic Lake. Dynamic Lake is software that implements something similar to the iOS Dynamic Island for macOS. So it's legitimate software, but in this case, the attacker emulates or mimics this legitimate software in order to trick the victim into installing malware. Kind of interesting malware. First of all, it's very specific on what systems it installs on. It does avoid virtual machines. It does avoid the M1 processor, interestingly, but maybe because that's often being emulated sort of in virtual machines. So that's probably why it's avoiding them. And then it installs 1 out of 4 sort of infostealer components that do steal the usual things like your keychain database, things like Telegram information, and of course, crypto wallet details. And it wouldn't be a podcast episode if we wouldn't talk about some kind of perimeter device security issue. This time, it's not actually all that severe. It's, just a denial of service in SonicWall, we have a SonicOS SL VPN vulnerability. It's a buffer overflow, but only leads to crashing the service. And while we're talking about SL VPNs, I just saw that Fortinet did announce that in their latest version of the 7th track of FortiOS, they're actually going to move away from SL VPN, and they're urging users to switch to IPsec instead. Well, and since it's Friday again, we do have another SANS.edu student here to talk about their research project. Adam, could you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, Dr. Ulrich. It's great to be on the program. Thanks for having me on the show. Yeah, my name is Adam Wilson. I'm a senior manager of DevSecOps at a company, R1 RCM. I've been working in application security and DevSecOps for several years with a software engineer before that.
Your topic was, well, one of everybody's favorite topic these days. It was AI related. Tell us a little bit about what the topic was.
Yeah, the topic, it came out of MITRE Atlas and trying to mitigate prompt injection with something that they prescribe, and they call it generative AI guidelines. And MITRE, with the Atlas framework, they're not necessarily trying to prescribe details on how to implement this. So this was an experiment in implementing generative AI guidelines, testing to see how effective are they, how can we use these in build system automation and shift application security left for the AI engineering lifecycle.
So the MITRE Atlas framework, that's something, of course, people may not be that familiar with. People usually, the MITRE attack framework, I think, is what everybody probably has heard of who is listening in here. How is Atlas different, and what does it sort of do for you here?
Yeah, I would almost describe Atlas as like an extension of the attack framework. And as you mentioned, most of us in cyber are very familiar with the attack framework. We use that a lot in threat intel and pen testing, red team operations. But Atlas is sort of this extension where they are focusing on how do threat actors attack and abuse AI systems and AI applications. And then, of course, they're adding in a knowledge base of mitigations prescribed for defending against those tactics and techniques.
Yeah. So, can you walk us through an example, like how that applies?
Yes. So one of the tactics that they discuss is something that OWASP has ranked as the number one risk against generative AI applications, which is prompt injection. And we hear about prompt injection all the time. MITRE prescribes 4 different mitigation techniques for prompt injection. They talk about guidelines, guardrails, model alignment, and AI telemetry logging. And this experiment focused very specifically on the guidelines mitigations.
Yeah. So, what would be a guideline? Basically, adjusting the prompt here to prevent prompt injection, or what's one of those guidelines?
Yeah, and it really, the experiment keyed off of how MITRE defines these guidelines. They talk about, and I'll just quote part of the definition here, that guidelines can be implemented as instructions appended to all user prompts or as part of the instructions in the system prompt. So that sounds an awful lot like prompt engineering, right? And we know that prompt injection really is a malicious form of prompt engineering. And so what they're prescribing here with guidelines is almost like fighting fire with fire. You're going to use prompt engineering best practices to help mitigate the effects of prompt injection. So one example of that, if we look at the landscape of prompt engineering best practices, we see things like chain of thought. We see few shot learning. And this experiment focused on what if we automate chain of thought prompt engineering within this guidelines mechanism. What if we automate few-shot learning? And then what if we combine the two and use a defense in depth approach?
Mhm. Yeah. And what did you find there?
So I think that one of the really interesting things about the experiment was that it underscored the importance of one of the first principles of cybersecurity, which we teach and we try to implement in our controls, which is defense in depth. And that in this experiment, no single control, whether it was just chain of thought or it was just few shot learning, we saw incremental improvements in the system's ability to defend itself against prompt injection. But when the defenses were layered, when there was few shot learning and chain of thought, when we're using both of those prompt engineering best practices, that showed the most dramatic effect. That was the best approach for mitigation.
Yeah, which makes sense. And now, when you introduced yourself, you mentioned that you're sort of in DevOps, and can you automate these defenses as part of a DevOps toolchain?
Yeah, once you have these guidelines mechanisms implemented as an automated control within the system, within the application, we can use, just like we use unit testing frameworks for testing different parts of an application. We can automate that, especially in the build system. One of the DevOps tenets is we want to shift any kind of testing, automated testing, as early as possible in the process. So we can do the same thing here, where we're testing these generative AI guidelines mechanisms early in the process.
Mhm.
So one example of
So
this
the
would
good old,
be like using GitHub Actions, where you can have these policy as code tests early in the build stage.
so the good old shift left that we sort of always preach for software security still applies. That we want to make as many of these tests early in the process and automate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and again, another one of these first principles of cybersecurity is that we want to test early, we want to automate, we want to use defense in depth, and using GitHub Actions or Jenkins or whatever build system is in your environment is going to give you a lot of insight very early in the process on, are these defensive mechanisms effective? Are they something that I need to pause my deployment process so I can go back and improve?
Yeah, so that's great. The paper will be in the show notes. There will be a link to the paper in the show notes. Any final words? Anything that people should consider or should focus on when they read your paper? Anything that
Yeah,
you want to?
one thing that I mentioned is that there's a lot of possibility here, a lot of opportunity for continued research. We can look at other mitigations that MITRE Atlas prescribes, such as the generative AI guardrails, which would be validating the output before it goes to the end user or before it goes to the next agentic AI system in the chain. And so what if we layered these, continued to build our defense in depth layers and added guardrails to guidelines? So I would want readers to continue to innovate and look at new ways to increase that defense in depth approach.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for joining me here, Adam, and thanks everybody for listening. And talk to you again on Monday.
Thanks so much.